Good evening. As you've just heard, this meeting is being recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded, you'd better leave or at least make sure your camera is turned off. My name is Christopher Garnett. Welcome to the first Anglo-Peruvian Society talk, the first event of 2021. I nearly said 1821 because, of course, that is why 2021 is so significant. For Peru and for the Anglo-Peruvian Society. It's the bicentenary of the independent Republic of Peru. One other quick housekeeping point, do please set yourself to mute so that we can't hear you if your phone rings or your dog barks. And we invite you to put in the chat function, you're all very familiar with this now, put in the chat function any comments or questions that you have for our speaker. So good evening once again. It's a great pleasure, I must say, once again to be introducing to you an eminent Anglo-Peruvian called Michael. Tonight's guest speaker is Michael KUCZYNSKI, Fellow of Pembroke College, Cambridge. Now, he shares with last November's speaker an education at a North of England public school and at an ancient English university. But Michael KUCZYNSKI's sphere of expertise is economic, not literary. Michael was born in Miraflores. Michael, I hope you won't mind my saying this, but you were born in Miraflores a surprisingly long time ago, I find, given your very youthful appearance. So congratulations on that. You lived as a child, you grew up in Chosica before a stint at the famous Markham College in Lima. Chosica, of course, just outside Lima, in the province of Lima. You did a stint at the famous Markham College and then came to England and boarded at Rossall in Lancashire, which I remember as a fearsome rugby side in the 1970s, before going to Cambridge to read mathematics. After that, Michael had a period working on the research staff of the International Monetary Fund, but not so long after graduating, returned to Cambridge to teach there, and he's been teaching at Cambridge since the 1970s. His work's mainly on macroeconomics and finance, as he puts it, on the numbers that are at the back of the Wall Street Journal. And he has a big specific side interest in commodities. He also teaches some of the courses in on the Latin American Studies program. Now, as part of the Anglo-Peruvian Society's series of talks to mark this bicentenary that I've already mentioned, Michael is going to get that series off to a start, off to a flying start, with a talk about the economic history of Peru over those 2 centuries. And the question at hand is, even though, or if Peru's economy has averaged better growth than Germany's or the UK's over the last 200 years, and Michael's going to share some numbers to prove this, why have standards of living stayed persistently inadequate? And he's going to invite us to consider whether, and this is his question in his own words, to consider whether his country shows us a case of a flawed polity and ramshackle public finance never quite taking advantage of the uplift of a succession of export tides, or is it instead a resilient inner domestic economy that has doggedly withstood the vicissitudes beamed upon it from near and far? So to find out how Michael answers his own question, stay tuned. And as I say, after about 45 minutes, which Michael will speak for, you have the opportunity to put some questions to him. I think we'll have those questions, as I said before, in written form through the chat box, rather than each person putting his or her own question through the video function. And I think that Carol has already put something in the chat just to show you where it is. So you'll see a red number 1 on your screen. So just click on that and type away if there's anything you would like to ask. So, Michael, thank you very much for agreeing to speak to us. I'm fascinated to hear what you've got to say. Over to you.
Christopher, thank you very much. Please interrupt me or find some way of telling me if you can't hear me or if I'm either too loud or too soft. I will admit to my debts Peruvians tend to have debts, and the Peruvian state has occasionally had large debts. I'll admit to my debts and my thanks at the end. All the errors will be mine. I want to start with a caution for reasons which I'll explain at the very end of this short talk. In Peru in particular, the past is quite mysterious. The population is not known really accurately until really quite recently. And for much the same reason, economic activity is hard to gauge at all accurately, again, until really very recently. And the reasons which explain that strangeness, that foreignness, are essentially the same, and they will wrap up my story right at the end, right? But by the way, most of this will be, unfortunately, quite a lot of guesswork. Those of you who know Lima will recognize the building on the right here. It's still standing. It's full of lawyers' offices, fairly run down nowadays. And the tram there has written on it, this tram is about to leave. And so this is where I'm going to start. I can't say that I quite remember this tram, but I almost remember it, because you will be able to gauge my age from the fact that I just got a vaccination today against COVID. The first thing I think to emphasize is that Peru, when it gained its independence from the Spanish crown, was very sparsely populated. If you want to think of an equivalent, it was almost like Australia about 30 years later, right? Peru had 1 person per square kilometer. Spain had 21, and Spain was not particularly heavily populated. So it was sparsely populated, but it happened to be, in terms of resources, a very rich country. So in that sense, the analogy to Australia is actually quite adequate. However, it had a population mixture which was quite different from that of other countries, which was sparsely populated and sitting on a ton of riches. The European population, as you see, was only just over 10% of the population, and the backbone of the population, who, as we will see in a minute, turned out to be the almost exclusive taxpayers, were the indigenous population and some mestizos and a handful of slaves on the coast. Slaves are taxpayers in the sense that they don't own their work, of course. So it had a characteristic which would make it quite different from, say, Australia or New Zealand in that respect, right? Peru started out rather larger than it eventually became when the Spaniards were forced to relinquish it. It was actually 40% larger in area than it ended up after a number of problems. And the little asterisks on this slide tell you the problems which were effectively settled by some defense expenditure, which emptied the coffers. I should explain that although the bits that were lost were all rich, right, they don't make an enormous amount of difference to the story, in my opinion, right? They make a little bit of difference in riches, they mostly make a difference in one respect, socially. So this is how it changed. For those of you who don't know the geography, it shrank essentially. My rather poor methods of showing this are supposed to make the two pictures roughly the same. And you can see that the original, which is on the left, is supposed to be rather smaller. It's about 60. The right-hand side is 60% of the left-hand side. Now, in 1821, it was a relatively comfortable place, though, as we will see, when the independence came, it came at a conjuncturally very awkward moment. In fact, independence was a response really to a long onset of a long economic difficulty. For those of you who don't know the drawings and watercolors of Pancho Fierro, this is a particularly nice one of a little bar in the center of Lima, which could easily have been there when I was a child. They more or less looked a little bit like that, right? Now, this is a chart which shows economic activity without the effect of inflation or deflation. In other words, it's what's known as real economic activity or real GDP, right? And it's extremely problematic to talk about this in a very dispersed, small population. So this is a guess. This is a complete guess. The Bourbons came into power in Spain through after the War of Spanish Succession in 1700, and in general, Peru, or the Peruvian viceroyalty, generally improved under their either as a result of or in spite of their administration. Between 1760, around here, there were a lot of Bourbon reforms which raised the economy or which are associated with the raising of the economy. But as you can see, before the reforms, it was on its way up already. If you're intrigued by the little red dots, the red dots are what is known as a Niño Fuerte, which is when the Niño current, which is the current that comes against the Humboldt current, and it's a warm current, and when it is strong, it creates a lot of rain on the coast. And because the coast has never been properly organized to deal with heavy rain, instead of being a beneficiary of it, it turns out to be very damaged by heavy rains. And so quite frequently, when you look at a long chart of Peruvian economic activity, you see that bad moments are associated with these red dots. There are some good moments too, but some rather peculiar. There was a very bad, strong Niño shortly after independence, which didn't help the general depression of the economy. Independence came just as the economy had been sinking for about 20 years, right? And it was very much a sort of reaction of the local criollos to the fact that they felt that they were on the receiving end of bad administration and bad transmissions from the metropolis, from Europe, right? And after that, of course, it recovered and the economy started to recover about this point. So the start was not propitious. Independence occurred essentially in a rather depressed economy. You now have to suppose that I'm a complete idiot. This is an attempt to give the what's known as income per capita or GDP per capita for Peru from 1595, which is when roughly reasonable accounts of local tax revenues, and in particular church revenues, started to be collected. And for those of you who are interested in these things, the scale is logarithmic. So in fact, there's a little bit more growth than it appears, right? But what you can see is that essentially from shortly after the conquest in the 1530s to the Bourbon reforms around here, it was chugging along at a very, very slow upward rate with a lot of downturns, right? Then came the series of rebellions, which were probably responses to very adventurous fiscal reforms introduced by the Bourbons, essentially to replenish the coffers. And the economy then started into this very serious downturn, which is almost its most serious downturn, except for the downturn which is associated with the war with Chile, which is the next one along, right? But independence came at the bottom of a serious downturn. For those of you who are not familiar with this, Tupac Amaru and Pumakawa are two rebellions which sort of gave the temperature of considerable dissatisfaction with what was happening in the interior of the country. Pumakawa is underestimated in my view, and is much more important than he is thought of, right? Then here is independence. And so the story that we're going to tell is essentially 4 upswings, 1, 2, 3, 4, interrupted by some quite sharp falls, the sharpest of which is the one which occurred at the end of the Guano period, and which is associated with essentially the war with Chile. Let me just explain that although Peru was a very rich country in terms of resources, very much richer than either Spain or Britain, right? It never achieved incomes per capita which were higher than those of Britain. It throughout its economic history, this is roughly speaking from 1780 to nearly the present, the per capita income, again, these are only estimates, the per capita income has, right at the start, it was about 2/3 of British income, but then of course Britain took off, and then it sort of dropped to, at best, 0.4 of British income, and then now it's at about 0.2, a little over 0.2 of British income. The relationship to Spain is much more interesting because Peru spent various periods with a per capita income which was higher than Spain's, right? During the Bourbon period, before the terrific decline, which I was just talking about, then again in at the top of the guano boom, and then of course during the Spanish Civil War. Right? I should just explain that number one here is when the Spaniards mounted an ill-fated adventure in the 1860s, in effect, actually, to take over the guano business. This is number two is, of course, the war with Chile. Number three is the Spanish Civil War. And number four is the rather poor showing of Peru during the period of the international debt crisis associated with what's known as the Volcker shock. All right. So those are the ups and downs relative to Britain and to Spain. Now, when one looks at things in the very long run, right, you sometimes find some surprises, right? British real GDP annually over this period of 196 years, right, has grown at just under 2% a year, income per capita. Sorry, no, real GDP. That's total output, right? For China, the figure is just a little bit over 2. For Peru, it's nearly 3. So that over this very long period, the Peruvian economy actually grew at nearly 1% a year more than the Chinese economy. Now, those of you who are familiar with Chinese history will know that, of course, China had an extremely nasty 19th century and so on. But, you know, swings and roundabouts, the interesting thing is that Peru grew faster than these other two. However, when you look at the population growth and you look at the income per capita growth, you realize that the rapid growth of Peru, much more rapid than these other two, right, is preponderantly the result of people, not of output per people. So in the case of Britain, about just under 50% of the growth in GDP, right, it is explained by population. In the case of China, it's a little bit over that, right? In the case of Peru, it's much more than the whole of the growth in GDP is explained by the growth in people. So to summarize, and this is the point that I want to discuss in the next sort of 20 minutes, right? The economy did well, but Peruvians didn't do so well. They had to work jolly hard. They worked very hard. The economy did well. These chaps did much less work and produced results which are not as satisfactory. That's the point that I basically want to comment on, right? This is a view of Lima, which you may be familiar with. It's taken from the Cerro San Cristóbal. And this is Lima at the beginning of considerable modernity in 1850. It's a watercolor. These were the 4 bursts or booms of Peru. Right? The first one is associated with a lot of periods of government, well, quite a few, by this person who's called Ramon Castilla, whose probably main contribution in terms of economic growth, right, was that in 1854, he turned the fiscal system upside down by removing the poll tax. I'll come back to that in a second. And then these are further periods of growth. The most recent period of growth has been fairly good sorry, excuse me, I pressed by these standards. This is a substantial growth over a fairly long period. The best period of all is the Great Boom, which is a boom essentially explained by mining from 94 to 29, right? Where it's nearly 4% a year per capita. Now, I don't trust the estimates that I'm going to give you at all, right? But I want to now discuss the characteristics of the growth, both the periods of rapid growth and the interruptions, which were sort of the periods of disaster. This is a view, by the way, of which was painted practically at my birth, actually, in Puerto Chicama, which is in the north of the country, a very rich part of Peru. I apologize for this interesting graph, right? It starts in 1595 and it ends in about 2012, right? The green arrows are the periods of bursts of growth. And you can see that with the exception of this one, the period of the burst of growth, this curve goes down. Now, this curve is an attempt to measure the extent to which economic activity is correlated, is moving together in different parts of the country. It's called a Moran index, right? So what's happening here is that the economy is expanding, but economic activity is not moving in the same way everywhere. And therefore, it's becoming more unequal. So inequality increases of economic activity. This basically means that you can have, let us say, Ayacucho booming, right? But Trujillo is not, right? This is quite a neat way of representing whether everybody's gaining at the same time or not, right? So the takeaway from this picture is that in this long period of growth, the bursts of growth appear to have been associated with not correlated growth, but uncorrelated or increasingly less correlated growth. So the tide did not raise all boats at the same time. Now, here's another feature which I'll explain. This is just the proportion of the population which is in Lima, right? And you can see that until 1910, right, it was growing rather slowly, and Lima was not absolutely huge. The same thing, by the way, occurs in Mexico City, and same phenomenon. And then, of course, it takes off, right? Now, the importance of this is that by metropolitan Lima, by around now, is around 55% of the population. Here, it was around 10% of the population. And this fact is important because Lima has two impacts on the economy, or it behaves in two particular ways, right? Now, this is, again, a lot of pinches of salt are required at this point, right? Because these are figures which a lot of objections can be made to, but these are various periods over which the growth rate in income per capita is worked out for Lima and for Peru as a whole. This is metropolitan Lima, Peru as a whole. And then this is the ratio of what's happening in Lima to Peru, right? And you can see that with one exception, which is actually the period when I grew up, but there's no causation there. Lima is disrupting the aggregate of Peru. In other words, when it's going down by more. And when it's going up by more, right? So the metropolis fluctuates more than the country as a whole. It's a source of, if you like, instability in the whole rather than of stability in the whole. And this is important in relation then to the next thing. This is an attempt to measure. A lot of objections can be made to this. It's an attempt to measure the inequality of income across the country by doing regional calculations and so on, right? And it's done by looking at a thing which is called the Gini index, right? And if it goes up, you're getting more inequality. And if it goes down, you're getting less inequality. And so you can see that under the Spaniards, everybody was sort of pretty equally poor. And if you're alert, you will have noticed that every time there's a collapse in inequality, there's also a collapse in the economy, which means that the downturns in the economy appear to be egalitarian, and the upswings appear to be inegalitarian. Right? This has slightly changed in more recent times, but only very slightly. So the takeaway from this chart is that if you look at the country with Lima, you get quite a lot of inequality since Lima started to be a large place, which is around 1910, 1915, around here. So including Lima, the inequality doesn't go away terribly much. Excluding Lima, the inequality goes away, right? So Lima is making for inequality, and it's also making for variability by the previous point. This, by the way, is very well known. It's a very well-known feature of Mexico City. It's a well-known feature of Naples in the case of Italy, and so on. Now, the other thing that we know is that over time, provincial incomes dropped relative to the capital, right? So these, I should say, this is Lima, the province. I'm not able to do this for Lima metropolitan, but the effect still remains. So this is Lima, the province, Trujillo, Tarma, Arequipa, Ayacucho. This is Huamanga, Cusco, Loreto, and so on, right? And what you see is that before the height of Bourbon Spain, right, Trujillo was 69% of Lima's income. Now it's around 30%, right? Tarma, the drop is even more remarkable. If you've never been to Tarma, you should go. It's a beautiful place. Ayacucho, the drop is completely astonishing, right? Ayacucho was nearly the prosperity of Lima in Spanish times, and is now, of course, poor relative to Lima, right? So income has become more unequal, essentially through metropolitanization. For those of you who don't know, this is a valley quite close to Cusco. This is in 1890, so about halfway through the story. And if you don't know what they're doing, they're basically tending the coca plants. Coca is a wage good at this time. It's not a little bit of it is sold in Chicago and so on, but a tiny, tiny bit. It's essentially a wage good. And it was a way of holding down the wages, which were already terribly low. So this is an enterprise which is effectively creating something which is going to contribute to lowering wages rather than raising wages, because it makes it possible to work at particularly low wages. However, I should explain that not everything is bad news, and I'm well aware that everything is sorry, what I've just said is complete nonsense. Everything is bad news, but there is a lot more detail that I could give you. This is a little bit of detail. This is a period of boom, which is basically 1915 to about 1929. The figures are missing there, right? And what you can see is that the gender pay gap, in other words, women relative to men in the sugar mills in the north of Peru, right? They were being paid initially around 30% less, and towards the end, they're being paid 60% less, right? So this is an exception to the rule that in a boom, income, actually, I'm sorry, this is complete nonsense. This is not an exception. This actually supports the fact that in a boom, you get even more inequality than in a downturn. This is the Jirón de la Unión in Lima, the main commercial street in Lima in 1930 at the height of the fastest boom, just before it all collapsed. Right? I now want to discuss very briefly one of the two underlying problems that Peru has had, which is the problem of being a resource-rich country which has not been able to achieve high levels of per capita income, essentially because it's worked too hard. I'll explain that in a second, right? This is a representation sometime in 1858 of the fiscal problems of the state. This is a rather moving set of data, which is the extent to which the tax revenue, which was direct, in other words, which was paid by people rather than when they buy goods in shops, you know, it's not indirect taxes, but direct taxes, the extent to which this was a tax on indigenous population, indígenas y castas, the two categories. And you can see that right before Castilla abandoned this poll tax, this is in effect a poll tax, right? it was providing 90% of the direct tax revenue, right? The indigenous population at that point was 60% of the population, right? So that not only were they paying a poll tax, which is a very inequitable sort of tax, but they were very inequitably paying an inequitable tax because there were far fewer than the total number of people. That was a tax, of course, inherited from the Spaniards. This was briefly at the end of the Bourbon period in the Bourbon reform removed, but then it was brought back immediately by the Republic. So the Republic reintroduced the capitation tax, right? Now, this produces a very precarious sort of fiscal system where you can see at the start quite a lot of the tax revenue is coming from poll taxes. What's not coming from poll taxes is coming from taxes on foreign trade. Oops, excuse me. And the rest is either state monopolies or peculiar things, right? Now, the guano is included in the rest. So you can see the effect that a boom in a particular raw material produces. By 1854, the reason why Castilla was able to remove the poll tax was essentially that it was being replaced by, in effect, a mining tax, which is what the guano tax was. Right? These bonanzas have happened all the time in Peru. This is the saltpeter bonanza, which occurred between 73 and 79 in the 19th century. And at one point, it reached 35% of national income, right? So there was a dramatic boom. And when it collapsed, of course, that explains much of the collapse of what then happened in the economy, right? Let me just remind you of what the biggest of these booms was in fiscal terms, right? And that was, of course, guano, right? This is the islands of Chincha, which is where the bulk of the guano was concentrated. And this is how busy they were, you can see, right? In 1863, this is just before the Spaniards had a misconceived idea of seizing part of this enterprise in terms of foreign debt and so on. So the Spanish fleet appeared here. This is not the Spanish fleet. This is the ordinary guanero fleet, right? It was then replaced very briefly by this mad enterprise of the Spaniards, right? But excuse me, sorry. The composition of revenues remained extremely precarious, right? So Peru, on the verge of the Chilean War, right, relied 40% on tariffs on trade, 50% on guano, and 11% on a few other things, right? Guano, of course, was about to disappear, right? And trade is a rather volatile component. Let me give you an idea of the costs of the war with Chile. These are economic costs, and they're not particularly well explained here. There's a lot more to say about this than I can say in about 2 minutes, which is all about that I've got, right? But this is what happened to per capita income in France after the Franco-Prussian War, which is very similar as an event to the Peruvian-Chilean War, right? The French were landed with very heavy reparations, much heavier than in the case of Peru vis-a-vis Chile, right? But the French economy sort of eventually recovered. In the case of Peru, the impact on per capita income of these are just estimates, of course, of the war with Chile was, as you can see, a sort of dramatic drop, right? From which eventually, of course, it recovered. Right? Peru has generally been a low tax country, right? This is the orange line is Peruvian tax revenues as a proportion of GDP. So it's what's known as the tax pressure, right? So it's sort of oscillated between 5 and 10%, and sort of in the 1980s rose briefly above 15% and then dropped down to 10%, right? This is terribly low and very ancient, and as you will have seen before, it was also already very low. Now, it has to be said, if you compare it to the UK, the Peruvian tax rate is practically half the UK tax rate. This is 95 to 2018. Right? But it isn't all that low in relation to Spain, which is the dotted gray line, or say to Singapore, right, which is even lower than Peru. So Peru is a country which hasn't raised much revenue, but there are other countries that haven't raised much revenue. So I don't think that low taxes are the only explanation of this long story. I want to close by giving you a very tentative interpretation of what I've been saying. Peru is undeniably a very rich country. Even today, it's extraordinarily rich. Its mineral riches haven't been touched. Its agricultural riches are even greater than its mineral riches, and all of that can be done perfectly sustainable. It's an incredibly rich country, right? But the evidence is that what pulled up the growth of the economy was the population rather than the riches, right? Now, if you have a sparse population, which is what Peru had at the start, and still to some extent does, right? Then this should naturally mean that you have much higher wages. So let me explain that in 30 seconds, right? If I land in New Zealand in the 1880s, I can just wander into the countryside and claim some land and instantly produce a lot of meat and a lot of wheat on it, right? And therefore, my wages are going to be very high. If I land in Peru, that doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen essentially for two reasons, which are the legacy of Spain. Spain left a lot of absolutely wonderful things in Peru, but it left these two wretched woes. The Spaniards taxed oppressively. They always taxed the poor. It's what in French is called a corvée. It's ultimately what, in a sense, led to the troubles which initially led to the French Revolution. Right? And you can see that in the inheritance of the Republic was to adopt, in effect, the same tax system. Right? That's to say, a tax system which is born initially by a poll tax which bears on the indigenous population, and eventually by a sales tax, which is a tax on alcohol and that sort of thing, which ultimately also bears on the population. Secondly, they left an administrative law system which is an impediment rather than an assistance to economic growth, right? So if you think of these two legacies creating difficulties, the bursts of growth that have been quite long, they're very pronounced and very successful, right, are sort of recoveries from the disasters that these two woes bring. If I were advising any presidential candidate for Peru at the moment, I would say that it's impossible to change the system of administrative law. That's a matter of a century or more. But it is possible to change the tax system and make it into a more efficient tax system. And that's what essentially should be done. And it hasn't been done. It hasn't been done at all, really. Let me just explain the point about administrative law. There are two systems of law in the world: civil statutory and common. They're not actually that different. They operate more or less the same. Right? But the difference is that if you have statutory law, you have to rewrite the statutes occasionally to solve current problems. And inevitably, you create new problems. So you have a sort of statutory revolution. You write a new constitution, et cetera, et cetera. Right? The advantage of common law is that it changes incrementally. Every time you discover that it isn't working properly, you change it a little bit. Right? And that means that common law systems don't create these accumulations of mistaken administrative law, which is one of the two curses which the economies like the Peruvian economy have been lumbered with. Please blame me for everything that I have said. I very much want to thank a lot of people who've done a vast amount of work, much more work than I have ever done on this subject. This is Barranco, and very near this place, the buildings are still standing, the ones on the left-hand side in the picture. Very near this place is a very nice hotel, which I recommend to everybody. Thank you very much.
Michael, thank you very much indeed. Fascinating. I think I know the hotel. I would also recommend Juanito's Bar, which is not very far from there, which looks very like the bar in your 19th century watercolor. Quite a few questions have come in from the audience, so we'll spend just a few minutes, if people would bear with us, trying to answer some of those. One point was in one of your earlier slides, you had a demographic, some demographic data, and you referred to the mestizo population, which of course we would generally think of as meaning mixed race people. But somebody was asking, could you expand on the cultural and social context of the mestizo element in the population, which of course is very varied all over Latin America. In Peru, it's by no means the highest, but it's certainly not the lowest either. Perhaps you could comment on that.
Well, the first thing to say about it is, of course, that initially this is an urban phenomenon. It occurs in all the major urban centers. Peru in 1820, as in a century before and so on, was a fairly sparsely populated but dispersed population. So it had urban centers. One of the things which has probably particularly made its problems worse, for instance, than those of Colombia and even of Mexico, right, is that its metropolitanization has been extreme. It only has one very big place now, right? Mestizos were an urban phenomenon, and they are, none of these terms have any meaning really. Their meaning is essentially a meaning in political economy, because you were defined by the tax system. So that indígena meant, or indio meant, that you were subject to a particular type of tax. Casta, which was closer to mestizo, meant you were subject to a different type of tax, and so on. And to some extent, and places like South Africa and so on are not quite the same, but to some extent, Brazil is very similar. You self-define, right? So that classification, which gives indios, mestizos, criollos, peninsulares, and so on, is a self-classification. In a way, it's the way people choose to present themselves. I'm not sure if that's answered the question.
It did define people's fiscal status at one point.
Yes, that's essentially the label is drawn from the fiscal from the fiscal category that they fall into. This is an appalling feature of a tax system. Anybody who designs tax systems would be horrified by that sort of thing. It is what a poll tax was. The poll tax in England, the poll tax that led to all Charles II's, Charles I's problems and so on, defined people in that sort of way. In other words, not by their economic properties, but by whether they fell into certain tax pay. So dukes had different rates from marquises, who had different rates from yeomen, and so on. Right?
So by race and status, essentially.
Yeah. Yes.
Or racially derived status.
Yes.
Another question that's been asked in a couple of different ways. How were you able, when you were going, appreciate your caveat about all of the figures being, a lot of the figures being somewhat sort of based on guesswork, but how were you accounting for the informal economy, which of course is by definition notoriously hard to measure, throughout your data sets? And I'd be interested to know if you think that the accounting for that informal element in the economy is more accurate now than it was, say, a generation ago.
Very interesting question. The informal economy is a modern phenomenon rather than an ancient phenomenon. It really dates from the introduction of supposed improvements in the tax system, like VAT and that sort of thing, which tended to informalize people, and a lot of practices in the labor market as well. So prior to 1965, the informal economy is indistinguishable from the formal economy, because all the things which distinguish it, like access to social security and access to sophisticated taxes and so on, don't exist, right? So it's a quite modern phenomenon. the way, and so to answer your question, the earlier pre-1960s estimates are not troubled by informality. They're troubled by a vast number of other things, which is, for instance, that there isn't any electricity consumption, which is a very nice way of discovering what economic activity is. If you don't have electricity consumption, then you have to sort of guess at what on earth could be happening because you don't have a meter that's actually counting things. After the middle 60s, informality becomes an issue, and then the process of working out what national income is, however, simplified, because you can work out, the number of buses there are on the roads and colectivos and electricity and so on. So it is possible to get around the problem of informality. So to a very long answer to your very short and good question, there is no problem over informality in these pictures. There are lots of problems with these figures, but informality is not one of them.
Well, I confess it was not actually my own question, but I suppose you could have a kind of proxy in a pre-mechanical age of things like, I don't know, number of horses sold or things of that kind, would give you some indication of the degree of movement in an economy.
Yes, the way in which, in many ways, the earlier accounts are somewhat easier to reconstruct than the modern accounts, because when you have relatively immobile populations, and you have things like the accounts of convents or of monasteries, and they keep very good accounts, right? So that the accounts of the bishopric of Tarma or the bishopric of Ayacucho and so on, then you've got a very good idea of what economic activity was. That is much harder to reconstruct in modern times, but you have to look at things like electricity, water, car repairs, changed carburetors, etc., etc. There are lots of ways of doing it. My very good friend Richard Webb, who is the father of national accounting in Peru, has all sorts of ways of doing this.
It's interesting that we think we know more, but in fact we know less, which could really be a sort of emblem for our times, I suppose.
Yes, yes.
And another question from a person in the audience: has there been any significant analysis of the impact of corruption on growth and inequality in Peru during this period, during the last 200 years?
This is a very difficult question. It's, funnily enough, it's something on which I work. You have to start from a definition of corruption, and then you can, from that definition, which not everybody agrees with, then build up an estimate of it and whether it's going up or down. And it depends essentially on the number of different types of employment. Corruption is essentially assigning a right or a job to someone who may deserve it, but has paid for it. So you first of all have to decide whether they deserve it or they don't deserve it, but they've jumped the queue and have got the right otherwise, right? So it's an assignment of a contract to somebody who pays to get the contract rather than qualify properly. Now, there are ways of estimating when you know the number of contracts, you know the number of positions and so on. how much you have. My feeling is that it tends to go up in booms and goes down in recessions. In other words, corruption is pro-cyclical rather than anti-cyclical. That's my feeling, right?
But is it a leading or trailing indicator? So is it going up pro-cyclically in economic upturns because of the economic upturn? Or could you argue that it's driving the economic
in an economic upturn, you have more contracts and you have more jobs, right? And quite possibly the proportion of contracts and jobs which are offered to the person who may be qualified or not qualified, but has paid for it, in my impression is that it rises, right? It's a very interesting, if I survive another 10 years, I might get to the bottom of it.
Okay, very good. I'd just like to come back, if I may, question of my own, back to your comments about the administrative law. As you know, because we talked about it the other day, this is a bit of a hobby horse of mine. I'm not quite so sure that there is as little difference between statutory codified Napoleonic law, let's call it, French law is what it comes down to, and common law. I mean, is it caricaturing it to say that the essential difference is that in a common law jurisdiction, that which is not forbidden is allowed, and in a codified law jurisdiction, that which is not allowed is forbidden? And if that is a fair characterization, that has all sorts of implications for innovation, contracts, building things. If you need 1 million screws to build a bridge, somebody has to pass an act of Congress to say 1 million screws may be bought. If you use 990,000 or 1.1 million, you've broken the law. Now that seems absurd to people who've come up in a common law inheritance, and yet that is true, isn't it?
There's something in what you say. I think generally the two systems are not actually that different. So if you look at a country which has effectively a sort of civil statutory system like France or Japan, decisions are ultimately arrived at not just by consulting the statute, because the statute doesn't tell you the exact number of screws, but it's by consulting the last decision that you made with regard to that statute, that the courts made with regard to that statute, which did say something about the screws, right? So in many ways, civil law looks to precedent just as much as common law tends to look to precedent. So they move along, sort of creeping along in a way, right? The big difference is that occasionally you rewrite the statutes. And that tends to be an exercise which is bound to be untidy because it's an all-encompassing exercise, which then leaves a lot of loose ends, right? Which a common law system corrects gradually, but a civil law system tends to be unable to correct things gradually. So if in the big reform, somebody most unfortunately wrote down that you needed 1,000 screws, right? Then you're stuck with that for a long, long time until you change the entire statute system, right?
Well, the common law looks at what is in front of us and describes it essentially and draws conclusions from it, whereas the codified law pretends to predict the future. Well, but I can tell I'm not going to convince you.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's turn to another question from the audience, because we've got a couple more latecomers come in with questions, very interesting questions. If you agree that most economic booms come from natural resources and external demand for those resources, how can a policy be devised in order to start a new positive cycle? And he's emphasizing this question that he doesn't just mean something like a fiscal incentive?
Now, two parts to my answer. First of all, I'm not, although I may have given the impression, and Peruvian economic history, for example, does give the impression that it's a series of sort of raw material export booms, right? My own feeling is that it's more complex than just that, right? But I'll get round to answering the question in the second part. It's more complex than that because Peru, like most economies, has an awful lot of sort of the domestic economy, which is actually quite stable, quite chugging along, which provides a floor on economic activity when the export sector drops down. The reason I gave that example of Lima being much more volatile than the rest of the country, or somewhat more volatile, is precisely because Lima feels the best and the worst of the cycle. But when you're in the interior, when you're in Tarma or you're even in Cusco, you don't feel the ups as much as you do in Lima, but you don't feel the downs as much as in Lima, right? The big net export demand booms appear to turn up a lot more for reasons you can tell, because that's where the buildings get put up and so on in the capital than elsewhere. How to get out of this, right? I think the recipe for a country like Peru, if you put aside important things like physical and social infrastructure, so leave them aside, right? The formula is fairly straightforward, right? It is to have an exchange rate which is not too wayward, in other words, which is fairly predictable. And I must say that one of the unelucidated mysteries of Peruvian growth over the last 30 or 40 years is precisely that. It really essentially over the last 20 years, that somehow or other, whether it's the central bank or I don't know, right? Somehow or other, the real exchange rate, the real cost of foreign currency, in other words, the cost of a Peruvian hour of work in real dollars has been remarkably stable, and providing it's kept at the correct level, and I think it's correctly depreciated a little bit recently, I think that helps enormously, right? The other thing that helps enormously is to have a fiscal system which is a little bit elastic, that is to say, that does produce slightly more tax revenue than there is economic growth. The Peruvian system does the opposite. It produces slightly less tax revenue than there is economic growth. The tax revenue is not elastic to the economic growth. So to answer the question, right? I'm sorry I gave the impression that it's a series of export booms, right? But there is a formula for Peru, and it's a fairly simple formula, which is try to discover how the real exchange rate was kept so beautifully stable for the last 20 or 30 years, and do something about the elasticity of the tax system.
Well, you're absolutely right. It seems to me, in pointing at the Central Bank of Peru, which has been one of the best and best run institutions in the country for 30 years. But on this point of the disjunction between economic growth and growth in the tax base, does that derive partly from the fact that so many people who are in that very narrow tax base are actually public sector workers who are therefore not, in a sense, generating economic growth or taking part in economic growth.
It's in relation to the tax system, your earlier reflection on informality is highly relevant. The tax system in Peru is a tax system which is designed in a way to reduce the tax base rather than to increase the tax base. It tends to create informality rather than to reduce informality. The tax system's got to be very gradually and gently and without too much doctrinaire approach, it's got to be reformed because it's a system which does not produce enough increase in revenue when the economy expands. And you can see that, it means there aren't quite enough schools, there isn't quite enough infrastructure. The state needs a little bit more money than it does have, right? And it doesn't get it in an upswing. And it's a matter of designing it gradually. A tax system's never very well changed radically. It's always changed by gradual improve. To change it efficiently, it needs to be changed gradually. But the Peruvian system does need to be changed.
Tax the drug barons is a comment from one of our audience members. It is perhaps a rallying cry we can take forward. We've overrun by about 15 minutes or so, but I hope everybody's happy. There are still 23 people paying attention to what you're saying, Michael, so I assume they're happy to be here 20 minutes, 15 minutes late. Thank you very, very much indeed for answering these questions. Thank you very much for your talk in the first place. It's a great delight to have you. Michael is, of course, on the executive committee of the Anglo-Peruvian Society. He's an easily contactable man. If people have questions in an esprit d'escalier that they decide they want to ask him about the intricacies of Peruvian fiscal policy, I'm sure he will be very happy to entertain those questions. But thank you, and thank you to everybody who attended. And I think we draw our session for this evening to a close until the next time. So thank you very much, Michael. Metaphorical round of applause. Lots of thanks for coming into the chat message. Everybody is thanking you, not surprisingly, and congratulating you. So thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you.